It brings me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, a man who has been an inspiration to law students and professionals alike, a man who has never been afraid to swim against the tide, and who has always stood up for what is right, even when it means, and especially when it means, standing alone. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce the Honourable Mr. Michael Kirby.
Thank you very much, Keynote, and thank you all for having me at this conference. Values matter. Values matter. I was taught that in my law course by a very great academic and great law teacher, Professor Julius Stone, at a time when every lawyer in Australia had to sign up to the view that law was a completely objective science, that the work of judges was entirely on automatic pilot, that the law would have lost its meaning if it didn't pre-exist, and that all the judge had to do was to find it in their bosoms, it was said, something at that time I thought was a mildly sexual and improper thing to say about the Majesty judges. One person stood alone and said, that is not how it is. Judges have choices, and the law gives choices. The choices he called leeways for choice. And Stone's teaching entered my mind and entered the mind of many of his students. It has been said that if you want to understand the Mason Court, you have to understand that the majority of them were the pupils of Julius Stone. Great law teachers, including those at Monash Law School, have a big influence, but it's usually 50 years delayed. And they come along, they gain great offices, and they have great self-realisation. So that is what I want to start with, the importance that we must all face as lawyers, that we have choices, and we must be transparent about our choices, and we must make good choices for a better world, as it's been said. Now, why did I find myself susceptible to that instruction? First of all, Julius Stone was marking, and therefore it was just as well to pay attention, because he'd be the person handing out honours at the end of the year. But secondly, I was susceptible because some things in my life had taught me that law was not always, as practiced, just and fair and wonderful and admirable, beautiful. The first was my experience as a very young boy at the age of 10 and 11. My grandmother's second husband, whom I called Uncle Jack, was about to be arrested and have his civil liberties removed because he was a communist. In fact, he was not only a communist, he was the national treasurer of the Communist Party of Australia. And that was not a good career move back in 1950-51. The Menzies government had been elected. It did many good things, including implement the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme, which the Chifley government had proposed. The Menzies government, the coalition government, passed it into law. But one of their pride of place proposals was to ban the Communist Party. And you, if you're law students or lawyers, know that that led to the Communist Party Dissolution Act 1950. It's still on the statute books. Have a look at it. Took away the civil liberties of people because they were communists. It was argued in the High Court by the leader of the Labour Party, Dr. H.V. Evatt, although opinions polls showed at the time that 80% of the Australian people supported it and had voted for Mr. Menzies to enact it. And we were in the midst of the Korean War and the Berlin blockade, and there were all sorts of reasons why Australians would be going along with it. You will ask yourself, in today's age of opinion poll politics, would a Labour leader have fought such a provision, and let alone go to the High Court and argue against it and win? The High Court, by a vote of 5 justices to 1, Sir William Webb didn't sit in the case, 5 to 1, the High Court held that it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice Latham dissenting. Latham's dissent is actually quite interesting if you read it. The core of his dissent was a quote from Oliver Cromwell, and he quoted Cromwell as saying, "Being comes before well-being." And his thesis was, we have a right to defend a democratic society against the communists because they are enemies of democracy, and democratic societies are vulnerable, as the world shows, and therefore we have a right to defend ourselves under the Constitution. But that didn't appeal to the majority of the justices of the High Court, who held that there were plenty of powers to do things to communists if they did things to you. And if they did antisocial acts, there was plenty of power to respond to that. But for what they thought and held in their mind and believed, that that was an area where the law did not go. That was their business. And the defence power and all the other great powers didn't go so far. And so the law was struck down. I've always thought, being a young boy who learned that this cloud had lifted from my uncle, and that it had happened because a court in Melbourne had declared that it was unconstitutional. I didn't quite understand all these things. I was 10, 11. But I did know that a very good thing had happened to our family, because a very nice and kind man was not going to be rounded up and have his civil liberties removed. And that, I've always thought, is one of the great moments in the High Court of Australia. Imagine my surprise in the Jack Thomas case, years and years later, when I found myself on the High Court of Australia. First of all, imagine my surprise finding myself on the High Court of Australia. And imagine my surprise when a number of justices of the High Court, specifically Justice Callan, said that or suggested that the Communist Party case had been wrongly decided. It wasn't wrongly decided, it was one of the really great decisions of which we Australians can be very proud, and we have to defend it. But secondly, a little while later, when I reached puberty and discovered that I was homosexual, I knew that I was a criminal and that the law was targeted at me, specifically at me, and in a very private aspect of me, a matter so private that I couldn't discuss it with my siblings, with my parents. I was just told I had to be thoroughly and completely and absolutely ashamed and never do anything, never do anything, because if I did, I'll be rounded up and I'll be on the front page of the Mirror. And that would not be a good career move for me. All of this is told in a magnificent book. A book of abiding beauty. A book written in a style which is engaging, uplifting, and a bestseller. I'm hoping that when the paperback edition is released later this year, that Alan and Unwin are going to make a fortune out of this book. Law students have been holding off because it's a hardcover book and it costs $35, which is far too much for law students, will rush to buy it, and it will outsell Lazarus Rising, which is the alternative view of Australia. This is a view that is idealistic and optimistic, and it's one, therefore, that you should all buy. And discovering that the law wasn't all that good, and indeed I thought it was irrational, and I tried to be very ashamed of myself, but I really couldn't feel very ashamed of myself. And in those days, very few people spoke up for gay rights. Very few people. Very few people spoke up for Aboriginal rights. Very, very few people in white Australia spoke up for the rights of migrants and people of different colour coming to our country. Not many spoke up for the rights of women. Most of them were communists, actually, speaking up for the rights of women and the disadvantages that women suffered in the law. No one at all spoke up for animal rights. That's my latest beef, and I hope that your organisation will become interested in the issue of the rights of other sentient creatures. This is a future topic of great importance. We've always got to ask ourselves, what are the things we don't see today? And if you're a progressive lawyer, you should be looking down the track and trying to see the issues of today and tomorrow. So what is a progressive lawyer? A progressive lawyer is someone who sees or tries to see the future and is engaged with the issues of the disadvantaged, believes the law has a moral compass, is concerned to exercise the leeways for choice in a fashion that responds in a principled and transparent way to problems that come for their solution. A person who doesn't believe that the law is a purely formalistic vocation. A person who doesn't believe that all you have to do is look at words. A person who is sensitive to the notion that the rule of law is not just a law of rules, but has a content, and that content includes universal human rights.